Hello and welcome to this webinar titled Enabling Comprehensive Data Analytics and Process Monitoring in Biomanufacturing, Key Success Factors, Methodologies and Practical Insights that lead to a successful implementation of software and practices. Hosted by Biopharma Asia Magazine and presented by Dr. Gloria Gadea-Lopez and Robert Dimitri. My name is Sri Patel and I will be the moderator. Now, before we begin, I would just like to remind our viewers that this event will be hosting a live question and answer session at the end of the presentation. You can submit a question at any time throughout the presentation via the Questions tab located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go through these at the end of the presentation. Now, please allow me to introduce you to our presenters. Dr. Gloria Gadea-Lopez is Director of Business Operations Management at the Shire Lexington, Massachusetts manufacturing site. She has over 15 years of experience implementing electronic applications for biopharmaceutical manufacturing and their associated compliance practices. She has led the deployment of integrated tools for data analytics, manufacturing execution systems, MES, historians, machine vision, and more recently, finance scheduling. She holds degrees in chemical engineering, a BS, food science, an MS, and a PhD in biosystems engineering. Her team is responsible for business operations analysis and operations technology for the Lexington, Massachusetts biologics site. Of particular interest is the impact of single-use systems, disposables, on MES, automation, and data analytics. Robert Dimitri is an Associate Director in the Production and Business Systems Group at Shire, leading a team for the implementation of electronic applications used for the analysis of internal manufacturing operations data, used to support the production of biologic drugs to treat rare diseases. He has over 14 years of experience in this field, having worked previously as a process engineer and developing software to perform process data analytics. Robert has a BS degree in chemistry and computer science and an MS in computer science and an MBA. I would now like to invite our first presenter, Dr. Gloria Gadea-Lopez, to join our webinar. Welcome, Gloria.
Thank you so much, Mr. Patel. It is my pleasure to join my colleague, Robert Dimitri, today to present the highlights of the data analytics systems and business practices that we have been implemented at Shire Lexington, Massachusetts site to support the efforts of continuous process monitoring. As you know, these type of projects, although they are in the realm of technology, to be successful, need to be rooted in the actual manufacturing processes and need to be operated correctly in the context of daily operations. Also, for these type of projects, we need to keep in mind that there is a larger context outside of the specific manufacturing site where we operate, which means that the strategy for manufacturing technology needs to be aligned with the evolution and the pace of growth that we're seeing at Shire. So in this presentation, we will be discussing the key factors that have influenced our decisions about technology for process monitoring. Robert Dimitri will be presenting the front-end study methodologies used to collect our user requirements, the implementation approach that we are followed, as well as the vision that he had about the implementation in phases. Later, we'll be discussing some of the outcomes, which include specific examples of data aggregation, analysis, reports that are benefiting our technical teams that support manufacturing floor operations. And in this section, we are going to include examples that are specific for single-use technologies. We have also used the site a second system that we use for real-time monitoring, and we'll be presenting some examples of that too. And now we are going to start with the first topic, which is the key factors that influence our decisions about operational technology. So here, we see that our scope of work is in the production of treatments for rare diseases. And it's estimated that 350 million people worldwide are affected with these conditions. One very striking fact is that of the 7,000 or so known rare diseases, only 5% of them have a treatment available. So one of the key requirements for operations is to have the right systems to support the efficient technology transfer, clinical production, and eventually commercial production, obviously under very strict compliance as new processes and products are available to our patients. Here at the Lexington site, we are manufacturing treatments for Hunter syndrome, Gaucher disease, Fabry disease, hereditary angioedema, and you may have heard it was recently announced that Shire is building a facility in Ireland as our production capacity expands. We have presence in over 60 countries with about 40 marketed products in all divisions and 17 manufacturing sites. And one also aspect that I want to highlight is our number. I'm going to go back here a second, sorry for that. The number of products that we have ongoing phase 3 clinical trials, that although not all of them are going to be coming necessarily to the Lexington site, we need to prepare accordingly if some of those products were to come to the site, and also to share our methodologies where sites, even external or internal, where those products will be manufactured. More specifically, I wanted to talk about one event that is significant in the expansion of Shire, that has been the acquisition of Dias and Baxalta. We have added new products and production sites, brings a variety of production techniques and functionalities that can be leveraged across multiple plants. Now we're going to get into the more specifics of our manufacturing here. So we have a plant in the city of Cambridge that uses conventional stainless steel technologies. It is designed for concurrent multi-product cell culture and purification, and uses single-use technologies only for media and buffer preparation. In contrast, we have also a facility located in the city of Lexington that was built to provide flexibility and involves also concurrent multi-product operations, but includes extensive use of disposable systems. And I'm using that term also to indicate single-use technologies. This brings a new layer of requirements to the process and materials monitoring. And we'll be seeing some examples of data analytics specific for single-use later in the presentation. This slide here illustrates the production areas where we use single-use systems. And we can see that the variety of unit operations involved is, there are multiple of them, and that means that we have a large and diverse number of single-use technologies that are used to execute the process. So the correct, let's call it cataloging and extent of data collection has been very interesting, I will use that term. Also a very productive exercise that has provided excellent insights into the use of disposables. At this point, what I'll do is I will transfer the presentation to Robert Dimitri, and he will provide his views from the system owner perspective on how he has approached with the team the implementation of the systems, the support that they provide to the organization, and the path forward ideas that we have for the future. Robert, please.
Sure. Thank you, Gloria. So I'm going to share kind of the journey that we had starting back in 2013 and where we are now. But, you know, one critical thing that we have to consider in our industry especially is because we are in a very heavily regulated industry, even with software tools that are used in support of things like operations, there's a huge compliance requirement in terms of, you know, meeting various requirements and guidelines by the FDA and other agencies. So that was a huge factor that we had to also be mindful of. So obviously there's various guidelines and requirements around doing things like annual product reviews and monitoring your process on a continuous basis, and making sure that your process stays within the validated ranges, things like that. And that's a really important factor for us to keep in mind, and it also adds another layer of kind of complexity and challenge when you do software implementations, because we need to be able to use these tools and the data and the information in them to be able to make decisions that will directly affect our manufacturing processes. Slide, sorry. So this started back in about 2013, and maybe others can relate, I'm guessing, but our original state was really just all paper source data, which is actually still some of the case, but we were transcribing data from paper into spreadsheets, but we were doing it inconsistently. It was often incomplete and only done when there was a critical need that came up, such as a critical investigation, for example. We had data that resided in data historians for the automation data. This is time-based data, but that data was lacking in various ways. There was no batch context, meaning you had to know the exact times for the particular batch or product that you wanted to look at, and that's tedious to look up manually. There was multiple data historians, so you had to know which one was used for that product or for that part of the process. We had some existing electronic systems, but no actual interfaces to those systems. So again, we were transcribing data multiple times into an electronic system and then manually outside of the electronic system. And the data really wasn't capable of being monitored in real time. So often, you could have an issue that you would not be aware of for some period of time. And then because of all this manual work, it could lead to long resolution times for any production issues that came up where we needed to then look at this data. And then just sharing these spreadsheets, the data, the analysis was very manual and not easily shared, maybe via email, but that would be inconsistent as well. So we kind of came up with some set of user requirements and kind of a philosophical approach to how do we get out of this current state that we're in at the time. We came up with various user requirements, but from a software perspective, we needed something that was scalable. So we knew, at the site, we imagined there'll be other products and processes that we would need to support in the future. So we needed something that would grow with us. We also needed something configurable by the people that understood the processes and the data, as opposed to we don't have a team of software engineers, for example. So we needed something that was commercial and off-the-shelf available, that would require minimal customizations to meet the majority of our requirements. We needed something that was compliant with all the various regulations so that we could use it and validate it and make it validatable to be able to then use it for any decision-making that directly impacted our manufacturing. We also needed something that could support an agile change management process. And again, for our industry, that's absolutely critical. I'll get into that a little more. But I think something like that is both part the software as well as the business processes you put around it. And then for us to consider the implementation successful, it's not just installing a piece of software on a server somewhere and walking away and you're done. We knew that we needed to make it successful, we needed things like historical data. So we have 10 years of data that we needed available because the nature of our processes are such that we don't actually have a lot of batches that we run a year, maybe 20 or 30 per product, which is not a lot of data in the grand scheme of things. So we need to be able to access our data going back from the beginning of that product. We needed the batch context available so it's easier for users to find the data that they're looking for. And then we just needed the actual analyses and models actually developed for the people to be able to, translate that data into usable information. So ultimately what we came up with was a kind of a multi-system, multi-part implementation. I think one thing I want to mention though is sometimes I think people make the mistake of assuming there's just one piece of software that will do everything under the sun for them. I don't think generally that's the case. I think there's different tools out there that have different strengths, and we try to put the right systems in place for the different needs that we had and utilize them for the things they do well. So one of the things we implemented was something called Statistica, which is now owned by TIBCO. We use that for the capturing the discrete data. So this is data coming from our paper batch records. It has a data entry interface. We use it to monitor as well, do our routine process monitoring in support of things like our annual product reviews and continued process verification. We also have an interface to our QC results. That's our Laboratory Information Management System, our LIMS system. And we can use that now to automate hundreds and hundreds of various charts and control charts and analyses that I'll get into a little more. Separately, we implemented something called the Pi Data Historian from OSIsoft. It is a data historian that basically sits on top of our previous data historians and provides us one place to access all of that time-based continuous data that is generated from our automation. That was really important because that now provides one place to collect that information, but as part of the project, like I mentioned, for that is that we also made sure to add the batch context so users don't need to go back and look up timestamps of when things were run. We also added historical data from the previous data historians into this system as well. And then that really set us up well for then implementing another tool called SIMCA, SIMCA Offline and Online, which we use to do the real-time multivariate modeling of our critical, some key operations such as our bioreactor operations. I'll give you some examples of that as well. So just to show kind of some visual examples, this is from Statistica. These are some various charts. So for the upper left one is an example of what we call like a bioreactor overlay chart. They take samples every day from the bioreactor and measure various properties and just understanding how the bioreactor is performing. And just to explain kind of how this chart gets created, basically we had all the historical data and generated prediction interval bands based off that historical data. And then what we do is take that and overlay the current lots, the current batches on that chart. And that's why you see those lines with it, and then in the center the current batch. So this gives us a really quick and easy way to understand how the current batch is performing in comparison to historical batches in an aggregated fashion. The upper right is kind of a similar type of chart. I think it was also a bioreactor chart, but the difference is that in this case, we actually overlaid data that came from small-scale clinical batches with data at the large scale in manufacturing. And this was nice because this was a clinical product, and it let us compare how it was performing at the large scale in comparison to the small scale. The bottom is an example of a standard control chart for drug substance release parameter, where this data is coming from our lab information management system automatically now, so we didn't have to transcribe any of this data back to spreadsheets, and this chart runs on a routine basis and automatically alerts people when there are certain violations, and people then can investigate it as opposed to manually generating charts and transcribing data. Another key capability that we have now via Statistica is we now also have access to all the ERP data from our SAP system, especially the material movements, meaning we can now do genealogy of our processes, understanding what was used in our processes, so the raw materials, the consumables, things like that, which is actually very important through the nature of our processes. Raw materials are some of the largest sources of variability in our processes, so it is really critical to have that capability and that insight to that data. And previously we did not have that, we didn't have that easily accessible. One example, to generate a similar chart like this took one of our team members a month to manually transcribe, pull this data out of SAP. We now can do the exact same thing in about 30 seconds. And so this is an example where we identified the genealogy of certain of the serums that were used for one of our products, and it's a multi-levels of genealogy needed to do that. But then we also took that information and even calculated the relative proportion based on the vendor batch information of those serums. So in terms of our final drug substance lots, meaning I can tell you that our drug substance used 60% of serum A and 40% of serum B or something like that in seconds now, and that can be very important to understand, where before that would have taken weeks of effort to generate that insight. Other examples where we've expanded the system, now other groups that were also interested in some of the same data, like for example, our QC group was doing manual transcription of data for their assays and their assay control trending from the LIMS system and manually generating these control charts. Now we're have about 80 to 100 of these automated charts that can run on a daily or weekly basis and automatically alert people. They're required to do this on a quarterly and yearly basis for all of those assays, and it can also take a significant amount of time, where now it's literally a click of a button to provide these pre-built charts. Other things we've gone into in terms of like various metrics and KPIs. Here's an example of where we send weekly automated yield summary for every product at each site that shows the trend of yield, which is obviously critical, again, due to the nature of our processes where we don't have a lot of batches, and even a small amount of difference in variance in yield can be critical, you know, towards the expectations that we have. So just kind of the current state with the statistical implementation, we successfully implemented it for our Lexington site, which actually encompasses 3 separate buildings, manufacturing buildings. We have it implemented from all the way from cell culture, purification, the ancillary processes that support those, like column packing, qualification. We capture even vendor information for critical raw materials and from their certificates of analyses. We have drug substance data, drug product, which is coming from CMOs as well. We even expanded to include cell banking, so that's kind of the step before cell culture. We've implemented for the 3 commercial products. We've also implemented it now for 4 clinical products that were launched in the last couple of years. We have it implemented for even CMO-based products that aren't actually manufactured at the local sites as well. We have access to now pretty much all of our data, including our SAP data, like I mentioned, our LIMS, the PI continuous data, as well as all the paper batch record data is being transcribed. We can now use it for things like the QC assay controls. We're going to be using it for doing stability analysis. And Gloria is going to talk about some other examples where we've used it in other areas, such as single-use systems and how we can analyze that information and doing things like risk analysis of our raw materials and vendors. And then the other critical factor, and it's been a big effort, but we've actually gone back and transcribed thousands of batch records of historical data into the system. So now that data is finally all digital and accessible very quickly, where again before it was just available only in PDFs. So just a few examples I want to now show for the SIMCA system, which is we are using to do real-time multivariate models of certain key parts of our processes. So this is an example of a multivariate model for our 2,000-liter production bioreactor, where again we overlay calculated plus standard deviations based on historical batches with the current batch in question, and this is very useful to be able to monitor in real time the performance of a batch. We've already seen an impact where it helped identify issues where things like a filter was installed incorrectly, or maybe a valve was closed when it shouldn't have been, things like that were able to be resolved very quickly, as opposed to letting that issue continue happening and becomes a bigger issue over time. This is a similar example for a clinical product. We implemented a similar model. We even were able to break it out into separate phases, so the bioreactor runs over many days, close to a month, and has separate discrete phases, and it was nice to be able to separate out the model into those distinct phases. It's very flexible, obviously, the software, and again, this was very useful for the real-time monitoring of our processes. And just kind of highlights for that SIMCA project, the way it started, we did a proof of concept to have multivariate models for 2 critical unit operations. Initially, actually, we started with a 200-liter seed bioreactor and 2,000-liter production bioreactors at our Lexington facility that can be monitored now in real time. Originally, we started with the offline models that would require the data to be updated manually, but then once we had the PI system configured and all the data available, we were able to quickly migrate those models and pull that data automatically now from the Pi system to the Simca Online within a few weeks. And overall, we've been able to implement now the Simca Online with models for the two critical unit operations for one commercial and one clinical product in 10 weeks overall. So it's very quick implementation, and it's already been very, very helpful and successful for our needs. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Gloria, who's going to talk about some of the single-use challenges we face and how we've used these systems to support those.
Thank you, Robert. So the slides that follow here were prepared by Mark Maselli, who was a member of our team and who is rapidly becoming, I would say, a subject matter expert in the field of single-use technologies. We realized that in order to succeed with single-use, we needed a comprehensive program that at a high level involves the areas of planning, specification, design and verification of the components, installation and acceptance, and maintenance. And what we saw was that we needed a very good process to capture the relevant data, as well as the information that we were going to be utilizing for each one of these systems to obtain more insights on how single-use were performing and what was, if they were affecting our product and our process performance. One thing that has been noticed in the industry is that the adoption of single-use technologies is growing rapidly. And also it has been observed that that rate of adoption and the level of knowledge about the systems are not growing at the same pace. There is a gap that we are trying to close, and we have seen how the use of data analytics has been extremely helpful in eliminating, for example, design redundancies, leveraging vendor data to help us select the right solutions for a given situation when multiple choices were available. But again, the critical thing here has been the programmatic approach to the collection of relevant data from multiple sources. One of those items, I would say, or data categories is component cost, and that has been critical in helping us determine the cost per batch that is attributed specifically to single use, and the cost of total ownership of the system, and comparisons of production cost between single-use technologies and stainless steel processes. But one item that is critical here is that, as I said before, we needed to collect the relevant data in a programmatic approach, and we needed to understand, for example, how each material can be used at multiple process steps, and how we could, let's say, bracket all those ranges of operations and associate all those values with that specific component. Another example of data collection that we needed to do was the definition of the components that are used for a given process step. So before we saw all the steps where the item was used, now we're seeing all the items, all the components that are used for a given step. So we look at the material descriptions, their operational ranges, their step durations and other values. All of this was organized and cataloged in a way that helped us understand the process and identify all the components. For example, when we needed to create new bills of materials for a new process, for a technology transfer, or for any other new application. So once we had collected all the critical information for the materials involved in the process, we could then calculate the level of extractables. And one of the requirements is that we maintain single-use systems that present low extractable levels. And here was one way of identifying what level of extractables we could expect from the process. So This shows the percentages of the top chemicals, in this case extractables, that was created using data from tables as before, plus data related to the chemical compositions and the potential of extractability at those process conditions. And also use statistical functionality that, taking that functionality with the data that we have collected, allow us to create very realistic models of the physical manufacturing process. This has been very, very beneficial to determine the toxicological risk and to calculate the cumulative amount of extractables. And see, this is another example that uses also workspaces, that functionality of Statistica, and in this case here to calculate the surface area for each component, and shows the top 7 subcomponents and their contribution to the surface area. So in summary, at this point I would like to say that it's critical that we collect data and information that we receive from all the steps of the single-use process, from suppliers to process performance and functional validation, in order to maintain a compliant monitoring system for single use. There are benefits beyond data analytics by cataloging this information. For example, for the case of manufacturing execution systems, where accurate bills of materials are very important. Let's see, another example that I would like to share is the calculation of material supply risk. This was also performed with Statistica and shows the various categories of risk: the vendor risk, the manufacturing risk, the proper material risk, and the use risk at the specific component at a given unit operation. So again, I want to highlight the importance of data collection and use of the appropriate analytical systems for the maintenance of a single-use program. Again, sustaining the process with data collection involves collecting all the right information that is coming in from our vendors, from the process performance, from the planning, specification, design, installation, and maintenance. And again, all the benefits that we are seeing through analytics only help us develop better processes that are more cost-effective in support of Shire's expansion. So at this point, what I will do is I will ask Robert if he doesn't mind presenting final remarks, and then we'll open for questions.
Sure. Sure. So if I was to kind of summarize some keys to success for our projects and kind of what we've seen, I think the things I would highlight is that successful implementation is not just having the right software; it's having the right people, and also in our situation, the right data with the right context. Like I said before, it's not just a matter of installing a piece of software on a server somewhere. You need to think about how you're going to use this system in the long term, how you're going to live with this system. Meaning, how do you envision it's going to be used to support your business processes in the future, not just on day one. Especially with a heavily regulated industry like us, I think another absolutely critical factor is understanding and developing an appropriate change management process of your system. For us, we knew we needed something that could expand and scale as our business needs were going to be growing. And you need to know that, at least again, for us, we know there's going to be changes for various reasons, and we needed systems that could accommodate those changes as well, but both be compliant in doing so while balancing it in such that it's also agile at the same time. That's a very fine line to walk, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that companies in our industry face around these systems. And maybe this is common sense, but at the same time, kind of be very clear on what you're actually trying to solve, what problems and what user requirements are you trying to solve. Sometimes I feel like people are trying to chase problems with systems and solutions that may not actually address those problems, right? So we knew up front the challenges we had and the user requirements that we had, and then went through the selection process of identifying the solutions that would help address those. So I think with that, just want to thank everyone for their time. We appreciate everyone calling in, and if there are any questions, we can take some questions as well.
Thank you very much, Robert and Gloria. I'd now like to begin the question and answer session. Just a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for either Robert or Gloria or both, please feel free to send them through to us on the questions tab, and we're happy to ask them for you. So, very first question. In the talk, you mentioned that your analysis and reports are built on data from multiple sources. What kind of preparatory work did you have to do to collect and appropriately aggregate the data?
Sure. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that you can imagine. I think, you know, some of the challenges we face is that our existing systems were implemented many years ago in some cases, and we may not have control over how data was captured over time, for example. So there's a lot of variability in terms of how the same information is captured over time. So we often have to do things like mapping the data so that it aligns it and gives you, you know, we may have something that have multiple variations of the same parameter, but it's really the same thing. So we have a way to map it and how to and align it, let's say, for easy analysis. We do all sorts of transformations and aggregations and calculations as well. You know, and it really depends on the particular analysis that you do. So some things we do up front, kind of at the database level, let's say, but a lot of times we do it more at the analysis level because it's very specific to that analysis. Fortunately, again, the tools that we have, in particular Statistica, is very flexible in that regard. You can do all sorts of data transformation, recoding, all that kind of stuff very easily and quickly as well.
Okay. Next question. You discussed a validation and compliance approach that seems very practical. How did you achieve that? And what were the key points of your validation philosophy that enabled change in the way you described?
Sure. No, that's a very good question. I think that's something we thought about early because from past experience, we knew that was going to be a critical success factor. You know, I think there's a few things that we did that I would recommend anyone to do. It's one, we just really had honest discussions with our QA and validation groups, trying to kind of both educate them in terms of kind of the general vision that we had, but then, you know, hearing their feedback and understanding how we can meet the general requirements as a company that we have in terms of computer systems like this from a validation and quality perspective. I think we also tried to be practical so that in the way we did that, one example is we took a risk-based approach. We did things like risk assessments, understanding, you know, the severity of risk based on different types of changes to the system or different types of configurations. Some things, you know, are obviously higher risk if you, you know, point the system to a new data source. That's a fairly major change. Other things might be more like configuring a particular analysis might be lower risk as long as you do it through already kind of validated, you know, means. So we had multiple risk assessments that helped us manage this, as well as how we actually performed the validation of the system and the approach. But it really was working closely with those groups and really getting everyone aligned early on in terms of the approach. And again, things like distinguishing validation versus verification, I think, is important as well. You know, so I think if you keep that in mind from the beginning, that's important. If you wait till the end or ready, you know, right before you're about to go live about things like validation, it's not going to be easy to do. I think it has to be built into the project approach as well. So again, we want to, and the other part that goes hand in hand with it also is the systems as well. So some systems, you know, require very specific customization or coding to configure it. Others, in our case, we chose tools that let us literally, people that just understand the data and have no background in any sort of software, you know, could configure the system easily. So the system as well as the validation approach go hand in hand, and that was critical to understand as well.
Thank you very much. Our next question. You mentioned various systems that you use for analytics. You have Statistica, OSI PI, and Simca. Can you elaborate on the types of data and reports you manage with each system?
Sure. So Simca and Pi really is stores the real-time data coming from our manufacturing process from the automation layer. So it's time-based data. We have sensors and things that measure various critical attributes like temperature and pressure and pH from our processes in real time. Those are measuring every few seconds, for example. Simca can take that data and push it into our multivariate models, and then we can view those models in real time as well. So that's what those systems are primarily used for. Statistica it has the capability to also view that real-time data from Pi. It has the interface to Pi, but we also really significantly use it to capture a lot of our discrete data that's coming from our batch records, coming from our LIMS laboratory information management system, QC testing system, and we use that to do other things like stability analysis, trending of some of our assay controls. We can now do genealogy with the data coming from SAP. Again, it's pretty much unlimited how you can use it or what types of analysis you can do. So like Gloria mentioned, we've expanded to even just apply it to things like risk assessments for our vendors of some of our critical materials and single-use systems. And it can really be applied to any sort of type of analysis that you want, as long as you have access to your data.
Okay, great. Next question. Is any of the data transmitted wirelessly?
So, I mean, we have automated interfaces that either in real time or based on a kind of a daily schedule will pull the data from some of the source systems. So Statistica automatically, or on a daily basis, automatically pulls the data from our LIMS and SAP systems, while the Simca system automatically will, in real time, pull data from our Pi. And that's all automated. It's done in the background for people. And I guess if that's what you mean by wireless, that's how it's being transferred. But you know, a lot of these systems are servers living somewhere, and the data is either manually entered or collected automatically at the automation layer, for example. But the real-time Pi data, for example, is coming from sensors that are networked in various ways that then feed it eventually to the Simca system. So they're not technically wireless, I guess, if you want to consider that, but in our manufacturing process, these sensors and data sources are wired and have network connectivity.
Great, thank you very much. Our next question, how are you evaluating the performance of the underlying control systems, i.e. the PIDs, that regulate batch production? Is that part of your current monitoring analysis initiative or potentially a future capability?
So what we do is that in parallel to the process monitoring, let's see, the process monitoring part is related to the production aspects. That we are not, I would say that we're not monitoring the underlying control systems, but it's something that once we have now the information available and these interfaces effectively transmitting data from each of the automation instances to Pi, now we can expand because all of that functionality is completely validated, and what we are seeing is that very rapidly there is an expansion of the use of all this data for multiple new users and by many departments. So also we are seeing, with Simca especially, looking at performance monitoring of equipment, doing prediction analytics on that, on maintenance, and there is a separate program on equipment reliability. So we are seeing an expansion of the use, but I think that the phase that involves the data collection, most of all, and the validation of the core systems and those interfaces for aggregation of the data have been completed, and I think that the sky is the limit now with all the possibilities that we're seeing.
Thank you very much. How do you handle instruments being calibrated? Can you capture spanned data making meteorology reporting easier, more efficient for analyzing process or troubleshooting?
Well, we aren't currently doing that. I think that's definitely possible. I know I've seen a specific example for Statistica where they are using it to calculate things like building models based on real data to calculate real-time mean failure rate times for various pieces of equipment, so they can, proactively either do the maintenance or replace, certain equipment. That is one area I think we would like to see if the groups that are responsible for that at the site, if they need assistance with. The capability is definitely there. That would be something that we've both actually done unrelated work for, metrology, and we understand that can be very labor-intensive, effort, and especially once you have, deviations related to that. So, anything that you can proactively do to prevent those issues, we definitely understand very much, the benefit.
Thanks. The next question just says, what is the network protocol used? I'm
not sure if I completely understand the question, or maybe some of it's beyond kind of our level, but one thing I know is that one of the reasons the Pi system is very successful is that it has built-in support for hundreds of interfaces. Like it can easily connect to various other historians or other equipment that's in use in industry. So I think it has 300 or 400 built-in interfaces. So that was one big benefit and reason to use Pi, because we didn't want to get into creating very custom solutions for accessing data from these various pieces of equipment. I know for Statistica, it's supportive of any standard kind of data connections, ODBC, Hadoop. Really any standard database is accessible from those systems as well. So pretty standard technologies from that perspective.
Thank you very much. So I believe that's all the questions that we have today. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our presenters, Dr. Gloria Gadea-Lopez and Robert Dimitri, for sharing their knowledge with us. Audiences can view this webinar on demand by visiting biopharma-asia.com/webinars. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Bye-bye.